Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Many agencies, scholars, and authors have documented an alarming decline in traditional Christian practice in the 21st century. Polling agencies like Pew and Gallup have delivered up many graphs which illustrate the demographic equivalent of a stock market crash. Fewer people are identifying as Christian, more and more are embracing the label spiritual but not religious. Churches are closing. Boomers who grew up in homes that read the Bible instead of prayer at least once a day are raising up a generation of millennials and Gen Xers who wouldn't recognize many biblical characters and couldn't recount many basic Bible stories if their lives depended on it. What do you think, Scott?
For sure. You see it all the time, even in media and stuff like that, where you watch a show and somebody will make a reference, and nobody will know what they're talking about, kind of thing. But definitely. And that's been going on for quite some time, but I think it's kind of culminating in a bit of from a church growth perspective, a crisis at this point.
How about in your own church? Have you noticed that your own church, the specific one that you go to, that numbers are down, that there's a trend, a decline?
I would say yes, especially since COVID.
Right.
But, on the other hand, COVID brought kind of a raft of new people, interestingly enough, as well. But not drastically, but definitely a bit. But Victoria, where I live in general, is not a very churchy place. And of course, pastors are always kind of decrying that fact. So in general here, for sure, it's quite palpable.
Okay. I know that there are some people who will push back hard on these claims of churches in decline. And they almost always refer to anecdotal evidence, what's going on in their own church, which they'll say is growing in leaps and bounds and the weekly services are as lively as ever. And that may well be the case, but it doesn't speak for numbers across the country. They're not looking at numbers across the country. They're not noticing how many closed down churches they pass on the way to their own church. And this may be not the best example, but it occurred to me, this is not much different than from family members of a loved one who's dying a long, slow death from some insidious disease like cancer or Alzheimer's. And they might celebrate the few good days that happen, and they'll say, hey, look, Grandpa's as strong as ever, and he's singing from the hospital bed. His health is rallied. And then they forget that there's going to be another 10 or 20 days where that's not the case. And then they look forward to when he's rallied again, but that too will dissipate. And this is what I'm saying about what some people are saying about the churches in their area. They're noticing the exuberance in their own church, but there's 10 or 20 other churches that are not exuberant. Some of them have even closed.
Yeah, there's definitely a good deal of denial going on in the religious realm. And I think also the local view can be skewed by the fact that we do have the rise of the mega churches, right, in the States and in Canada.
Right.
So that can make it look like, we got these mega churches. People are pouring in, are becoming more religious. But what we don't realize is that those mega churches are more of a consolidation. They're mainly composed of former people from all these other churches,
right, yep,
that have totally declined. So when you look at the overall numbers, like a statistician will do, then you realize that that's a deceiving picture.
Yep. You were saying earlier, churches poaching from each other.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I've seen situations back when I lived in Burlington, Ontario, where a mega church would move into it's not much different than retail competition, right?
Right.
And you have all these little churches, and then a mega church will move in and plop itself right in the middle of all those churches. And of course, it will pull a good number of members because it has resources, it has really top equipment, it has great music and all this kind of stuff. And it'll really drain away a lot of people from the other churches. And there's often not a lot of thought to that. The attitude is, we're doing a better job and we're reaching people for Christ. But they're not really reaching people for Christ. They're just recycling people for Christ. Yeah.
But this has been a long, drawn-out process of church decline. It's been playing out for decades. It's well documented, especially since it was very accelerated following COVID-19. And I'm sure it doesn't come as any surprise to our listeners, but an article came to me, caught my eye through my social media feed. The title was, Sociologist Wonders If That Old-Time Religion Is Now Extinct. Written by Dr. Sean Paul Wood at Woodward Communications. Scott, now extinct. What do you think about that?
No, that's a pretty shocking title. It grabs your attention for sure. My first reaction would be, well, it's a bit extreme. It's, it's not extinct. But within the context of what he's saying, that old time religion, yeah, that may be extinct, except for somewhere in Appalachia or
Right. I know what you're saying, Scott. I thought we needed to hear from this sociologist that Dr. Wood was writing about. We checked into this sociologist, Dr. Christian Smith from Harvard. He's a PhD in sociology at Harvard. He also did a year of MTS training at Harvard Div School. He's currently the William R. Keenan Professor of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. We reached out to Christian Smith, and he was very happy to come tell us all about this extinction of old-time religion. He's a prolific author, 21 books, countless chapters, reports, and review articles, and he has this current book that he's going to be telling us about. Dr. Christian Smith is right here in the studio. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Sure thing. Thanks for your interest, and I hope this discussion is really interesting to your listeners.
I know it will be. I've read your book, I've seen your interviews, and I know this is going to be great. I've got to say, I love the book. You've put a lot into it, but I also love what isn't in the book. We were talking briefly about this with you in the pre-record. There's a really interesting part of the book that you hint at something big and ominous. It's ominous to me, at least, that's coming over the horizon, and I'm looking forward to talking a bit about that. But first, let's get into this book that's on the table. Why Religion Went Obsolete, The Demise of Traditional Faith in America. Now, Chris, you're not the first person to write about how Christianity seems to be in retreat over the past many decades, but your book takes it a step further in a very provocative direction. You use an interesting word here, obsolete. You're not playing with euphemisms like decline or dwindling or even changing, but obsolete, that's a whole different story. And you don't even give it the benefit of the doubt by saying it's on its way to being obsolete. Your title asserts that it already has gone obsolete. So let's talk about this word obsolete. What does it mean? What does it not mean? And why you chose it?
Yeah, so most of the discussions about the fate of religion lately use language like decline. Decline is something that is measurable. It focuses on organizations, whether your membership has declined. It focuses on individual characteristics like beliefs, say belief in God or religious service attendance, and you could say that's declined. So it's a numerically, organizationally oriented thing. I'm trying in this book to get much more at a larger macro cultural sensibility of what I end up calling a zeitgeist that emerged in the 90s and early 2000s. And I think the word that really captures what happened at the cultural level, not the organizational level, is obsolescence. By obsolescence, I mean, most people feel like whatever it is that's gone obsolete isn't useful or needed anymore because something has superseded it in its function or value or efficiency or interest. But what's important here, I think one of the advantages is that obsolete doesn't mean something is useless or failed. Something can go obsolete and still be completely useful and functional for those who want to use it. It's just that fewer and fewer people want to use it. So there's still plenty of people who are religious in various ways, but I'm talking about the status of traditional religion in the macro culture. Obsolete also has the advantage, I think, that it doesn't mean that it's been totally abandoned or extinct. It's not gone. So images I use or metaphors or analogies for religious obsolescence are like Western films used to be really popular in the 50s and into the 60s, and now they just feel like old-fashioned. They're occasionally, it's not because there's anything wrong with them. I mean, Westerns could be great, but they're just kind of gone obsolete, or what laptop computers did to electric typewriters, or what streaming services did to DVDs. All these things, they still function. I still have CDs and DVDs in my house, and my stereo's still set up. But they've gone obsolete in the larger technological world, right? So what I'm saying is I think that this language of obsolescence is more subtle and more incisive than simply decline, because it acknowledges it's not an either or. It acknowledges that they're still religious people, but they're operating in a different environmental, cultural context.
Right.
Kind of out of step, I guess, with the greater
culture, like they're still doing their thing. But now, whereas that thing they did was at one time was fairly mainstream,
Yeah.
now all of a sudden it's countercultural in a sense.
Exactly. And that can make it harder to practice. So back to the electric typewriter example. Let's suppose I want to keep typing on a typewriter. I'm against computers. Well, that's great. I mean, I can do that. But to do that, I need ribbons. I need repair. They're like it's a social support, social interaction function. And so people that still want to do religion in an obsolete environment have a harder time pulling that off. Also, there are other things we call network effects, which are you've got to have enough other people doing it or else it doesn't work, like email or community choirs. Like you can't do a community choir with two people. So yeah, it's so this is the idea. It's not just does this person or that person believe this or that. It's what is the larger environment, the ecosystem, so to speak, within which traditional religions operating now.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess implicit in that word or phrase, going or went obsolete, is the idea that it has been replaced. And we'll talk later about what religion might have been replaced with. But implicit in that word is also the idea that it's not necessarily replaced with something better. It's just the thing that it replaces it might be cheaper, easier, more convenient. And so you use several examples. The typewriter was one, but the record player. There are people who still have record players they swear by. They say that the digital music actually has lost something. It's not as good, but it's certainly a lot more convenient.
Yeah, people that really are music aficionados, some of them say, vinyl is the only thing worth listening to. And so that may
Right.
have been better. Yeah. And again, there's like where I live in Indiana and Michigan, there are Amish people around who drive horse and buggies on the road, and in some ways, I think that's a better way to get around probably than our complex gas guzzling vehicles. So obsolescence is not a judgment against religion. It's a descriptive observation about how the larger culture has changed. And again, to be very clear, I mean this about traditional religion, not everything that could be considered religion. And this mostly applies to post-boomers, that is, Gen Xers, millennials, and Gen Z, younger generations of Americans.
I like the analogy of the Amish because at one time, 100 years ago, or well, maybe more than that now, they weren't countercultural. Everybody was driving buggies and with horses, and they would have just been a different maybe group, but they would have been within that. And now they stand out as being completely countercultural. So
Yeah.
it's a good analogy.
Yeah. And again, to reinforce this point, they're allowed to do it by law, but it's more hassle. They have got to, pursue legal means to make sure they don't get run over by 18-wheelers. And so
Yeah,
it's just harder. It's harder.
right.
So, Chris, there's a couple more things I want to talk about the obsolescence, and then we'll get into the causes and the factors. But about this obsolescence, we're used to the idea of obsolescence as often a planned obsolescence. Companies that make things plan for these things to go obsolete and need to be replaced. This is an unplanned obsolescence, and you even talk about how it's self-inflicted. What do you mean by this unplanned and self-inflicted obsolescence?
Yeah. So there are a set of still religious people that tend to be conservative who tend to want to find actors in the world who are out to get them, liberals or the media or secularists, secular humanists or woke people or whatever it may be. There's this idea that if religion is having a hard time, it's because anti-religious actors are out to get them. So my argument in this book is that almost all the forces that drove religion into obsolescence were unplanned. Nobody intended them. So if you think about the internet or the end of the Cold War or other things that I discuss helped to bring this about, people didn't invent the internet to sort of cut the legs out from traditional religion. They invented it for other reasons. Lo and behold, in social life, things have unintended consequences. This is one of the fascinations in sociology, all the unintended consequences. People intend to do one thing, and that has consequences that were unforeseen and people weren't necessarily interested in. So, in part, my argument is maybe to tone down some of the culture wars around religion and get people to stop personalizing that someone is out to get us and blaming specific groups who are responsible for this. Another part of it is just to help form people's understandings about how history and culture work and our imaginations about why things change and to realize it's complicated. In this case, my argument is that the forces driving obsolescence are long-term, they're complex, they were unintended, as we're discussing. Most were unrelated to religion. They didn't have to do with religion. So that's important to know. Like, it's important to have a more complex view of how the world works than a simplistic way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think of something like YouTube. YouTube wasn't invented to destroy religion, but YouTube has had a big cultural impact, and the fact that now you can readily hear so many voices, so many different opinions, that is a big impact on not just religion, but everything we discuss. And but it does have a big impact on religion, but it wasn't targeted toward that. Is that what you're kind of?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Now, having said that, there were some anti-religious forces, the New Atheists being one of them in 2000. But the other thing I argue in the book is, which Luke mentioned, is religion did a huge amount to hurt itself, to shoot itself in the leg. And in my estimation, what religion did to damage itself is much more consequential than the intentionally anti-religious actors. So it's really a matter of putting everything into perspective and assigning causal weights to what I think, where they belong. And so religion itself is partly and significantly responsible for its own demise.
Okay. One last point before we get into those factors. In the subtitle, you say that this is about traditional faith in America. You're being very specific. This is not religion everywhere, all religions everywhere. This is traditional faith in America. So maybe unpack that.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that in your subtitle?
Yeah, so one of the things I want to say is that this is a story about the United States, about America. There are numerous things in it that are particular to the United States. The Christians in politics, moral majority, Jerry Falwell, all that. I am not trying to advance a general model of how religion operates in modernity. I would expect the way this plays out in Canada and England and elsewhere is different and would require its own story. So first, there's the particularity of America. Second, I'm focused on what I'm calling traditional religion. Most people like to call this organized religion or institutional religion, but the reason I don't use those terms is there are other non-traditional religions that are institutionalized and organized. I mean, it's pretty hard to be a religion without being organized. So what I mean by traditional religion, there's a precise definition in the book, which I don't have off the top of my head, but basically multi-generational faiths that have sacred texts that try to carry on particular religious visions of reality. So what we're talking about here in the American context, to be specific, is mainline Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism, Catholicism, Black Protestantism, most of Judaism, and maybe Islam, and Mormonism too. What this doesn't include is Wicca, witchcraft, paganism, New Age, esotericism, alternative healing, crystals, vampire underground. Those are not traditional religion in America. Those are alternative religions or quasi-religions that my argument isn't trying to explain.
And you also did not include Eastern religions.
Yeah, I kind of am on the fence in the book about that because clearly Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism are traditional religions. I mean, they're very old. They have incredibly deep and complex traditions, but not in the United States. They're relatively, I mean, there have been traces of them around a long time, but their profound influence is relatively recent. And because things like New Agers like to draw on them for some of their sources of ideas, I basically say, well, I'm not sure about this, but I'm not counting them as traditional religion.
Okay. And one other thing that came out as I read the book, it's not in your subtitle, but in addition to this being about traditional faith as opposed to non-traditional and about America specifically, we're also going to find out that this phenomenon we're going to be talking about is very much it's the perception of obsolescence is not perceived by people like Scott and I, boomers and older people, but it's the younger generation, the millennials and Gen X's. they're the ones that perceive this obsolescence. So it's very much a generational phenomenon.
Yeah, when it comes to these matters, generations are huge. Boomers sort of laid the groundwork for it, but they didn't jump into it big time. It was really Gen Xers who were the hinge of history here and millennials who developed it out. And I have a chapter where I show some of the statistics on this, just the differences between generations. So the process, another way to think about it is the process of religious change is not within lifetimes for the most part. Some people do change their religious views within their lifetimes, but people are pretty stable in their religious views. So that means that the processes of change or decline or obsolescence, whatever you want to call it, is not individual lives are changing. It's more each generation is different than the one that came before it and then passes on and operates in a context that's different. So it's very much what we call generational replacement.
I have to say, when I read the book, there's one figure in there that made my jaw drop, figure 1.1. It shows over the course of many years, the percentage of people who would say religion is very important in their lives, a strong influence. And the point is, in that figure, you see how with each of those generations over the many years, not only is the percentage of people who find that religion is strongly relevant in their lives, it decreases with each of those generations, but the ones that are boomers and older, it's sort of stable, even though they kind of dropped across many decades, they've dropped a little bit, but they're kind of stable across the decades. But when you get into the millennials and the Gen Zs, they start so much lower and they plummet.
Yeah.
And my jaw dropped when I looked at that.
Yeah, it's really amazing. For older generations, the traditional life course experience was as you get older, say from age 20, as you go into your 30s and 40s, have children, settle down, people would get more religious. So there would be actually an increase over the course of single lifetimes to get more religious. Well, that stopped with Gen X, and they didn't get more religious. And then millennials, just the older they got, the less religious they became.
Right.
They were just further away from the faith of whatever they might have been raised in. And so you can imagine this all has concatenating effects when younger generations grow up, have children and families. What are they going to teach their children? Some people hope in all this. Some people ask, well, can't there be a big revival? And I'm not in the business of predicting the future or managing the Holy Spirit or anything like that. But sociologically speaking, you have more and more people raising kids who aren't religious. And the biggest factor on whether somebody's religious is what their parents are. So, yeah, sociologically, things are not promising for traditional religion here.
Okay, so then let's get into the heart of the matter. Why is this happening? And you give 5 chapters to this, chapters 4 to 8, and you list events and slow-moving societal trends and things rooted in culture and science and politics and economics, all of these coming together into a perfect storm. Or I think you use the plural, perfect storms converging.
Perfect storms converging,
Yeah, so let's talk for a good amount of time on all these different, well, not all, on some of the key factors that played into this obsolescence.
Yeah, there's a long list of complicated forces. And going back to, in the 70s, women entering the paid workforce. So it's not enough in this kind of historical cultural work to just say, well, this is correlated with that. You need to explain the causal mechanism. So, and again, I'm not judging either way, should women have gone into the paid workforce. That's not the point here. But when they did, it means previously, when women were at home and housewives, there was much more of neighborhood community, and churches and other religious congregations were able to draw on essentially women's free labor to help make the church run. Well, when women go into the workforce and they start working double shifts at work and home, there's not as much free labor to help keep congregations going and to teach Sunday school and so on. So there's just less support. That's one little example. The deinstitutionalization of marriage and family is another long-term trend. That means rising divorce rates, never getting married, delayed marriage, voluntary childlessness, or waiting a long time to have a child, cohabitation. These are all signs that the quote-unquote traditional family, the nuclear family, it just changed over a long period of time. Well, it turns out that in America, religion is very closely tied to the family. It mostly caters to traditional families. And so the greater the portion of the population you have that's divorced or cohabiting or whatever they're doing, they go to, let's suppose they go visit a church, they just don't feel at home as well as the other. Like it's just not set up for them. And so everyone knew these trends were happening, but they wrap up into consequences over time, especially if religious traditions don't adjust themselves for new kind of family forms. So other forces at work that I discuss are declining participation in face-to-face membership organizations, community organizations, sports clubs, etc. Again, that's just a well-known long-term trend. The rise of emerging adulthood, that's a complicated subject I've written about elsewhere, but the idea is between being a child and a full adult, there's a period of time of transition. And for various reasons, that has extended itself for especially post-boomers. So people spend 10 years, even more, sometimes sort of being unsettled, delaying settling down, being free, exploring possibilities. And since in America, settling down and participating in traditional religion are commonly associated, when people delay for 10 years settling down and becoming a quote unquote real adult, that has consequences for when they think they're supposed to start going to religion. So other forces are the rise of televangelism in the 80s and the religious right in the late 70s and 80s. There's a huge reaction, a huge sort of cultural mocking, or a lot of people who were formerly willing to think of themselves as religious, they saw religious involved in conservative and right-wing politics. They said, if this is religion, I'm going to have nothing to do with it. So there was a huge reaction against that. The end of the Cold War, I make an argument, was really huge in the United States. The Cold War for all the middle of the 20th century, we defined ourselves in the US as sort of the God-fearing, free, worshiping nation who was fighting godless, atheist, Marxist communists. And whether or not anyone was personally religious, at the level of national identity and mission, that was part of what we were, God-fearing. And during this era, there were actually many efforts made to sort of boost religion during, say, the Eisenhower era. And there was, in fact, a huge post-World War II boom in religion. It fit the era. Well, when the Cold War is over and you don't have an atheist enemy to fight anymore, then you have to figure out, well, what are we now? Who are we against? Who are we for? And I think that threw a monkey wrench into the place of religion in American public life. So those are some examples. The list just goes on and on. I don't know if you want me to keep talking or...
Well, there's a few more that I think are worth talking about. So the rise of postmodernism.
Yeah, so basically what I say in the book is 1991 was the year when obsolescence started, or when the millennial zeitgeist really emerged. That's the year when Americans on surveys started increasingly saying, I'm a religious none. I don't belong to any religions. But a lot of religion, but a lot of other things were at work. It was the end of the Cold War, etc. But postmodernism, you might think of it as a dumb or a sophisticated theory, but it originates in European philosophy and literary studies. It comes across and has a big influence on the American professoriate. And by the 90s, I remember this as a professor in the 90s, it was just really influential in thinking. It had to be addressed. But by the time it gets down to undergrads, say, it's not the original version of postmodern deconstruction. It's what I call pop postmodernism. And it basically teaches that, or what people took away from what it teaches, is sort of like, you can't trust authorities. You don't know what an author really meant. All knowledge claims are really power moves to try to control you. It's very Nietzschean, very Foucauldian, suspicion, distrust, deconstruction, which just does not fit well with traditional religious claims. And so the more that was out there and sort of spread in popular culture, like soft nihilism, and even in the media, shows like Seinfeld, which were hilarious, but they basically weren't about anything, that it's an expression.
And they were proud of it.
And they were proud of it. And it's a comedy expression of this kind of way of seeing the world. It's not serious. It doesn't have a historical project. There's no eschatological horizon. So postmodernism really told a whole generation, it's all relative. It all depends on your culture. Suspect all truth claims, etc. That had a huge and diffuse cultural influence, in my opinion, on I mean, I just think it's a fact on sort of consciousness and that had consequences for religion.
How about the internet, Chris? That came up at this time as well.
Yeah. So, in my view, if I was forced to rank the most important influence in religion's obsolescence, it would be the digital revolution, the spread of the internet, early on chat rooms, now, social media and so on. The internet has some really good functions to it. I use it a lot, but as far as traditional religion goes, I spell out in like 9 or 10 distinct causal ways that the internet ended up undermining religion's relevance or strength. It's everything from just consuming people's time to giving people sources of information they didn't have before about
Hmm.
alternatives or critiques, helping people connect to different communities of disaffiliated people. For example, in Mormonism, there's a large and influential movement of ex-Mormons as a community that are trying to help people leave. You don't meet those people on the sidewalk of Salt Lake City. You find them on the internet.
Yeah.
Alternatives to religion, like a culture and reenchantment, which we're going to talk about. If you're interested in paganism or magic or whatever, again, that's kind of spread out demographically. So, but you can meet them on the internet and realize, wow, this is a huge community. There's a lot of people doing this. So, I think the internet changed people's capacity for attention and concentration. It trained us to always want to be stimulated, to look at the next thing, to find something really that pops for us all the time. You know, in various ways, this undermines the idea of like, okay, now we're back on the church calendar and it's time to meditate and we have to sing, we have to see all these same people again, some of whom annoy me. Instead, you can make friends and delete friends and whatever as you wish on online. So again, I spell all this out in the book in detail, but the internet unintentionally, again, really was a huge factor driving religion and American religion into obsolescence.
Yeah, I think that especially with regard to the local church, I mean, it's probably a very male thing, but I do think that the center of attention in the evangelical world it has been preaching, has been oratory. And maybe you're lucky and you have a pastor who's very well read and a great orator, but that doesn't tend to be the norm. And now you can go on the internet and listen to the very best in the world on these various things. That's pretty tough for the local guy to compete with, you know.
Yeah.
And I think it fits into this obsolescence narrative because churches that just ignore that and say, well, we're called to preach and and that's what we believe and so on, and just continue doing it, they do become obsolete, in the sense that people choose a different alternative. And I've heard a lot of kind of whining amongst pastors and so on about that situation. But what they really need to do is change. They need to realize that that doesn't cut it anymore. And so they're going to have to figure out what is their place and what is the best way to reach people and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so here we have a case of a technology designed for one thing has consequences for people's lives and missions in another world. And I would say, even if a lot of people sitting in the pews, let's say, even if they're really interested and they want to learn and so on and so on, younger generations have been trained to sit and listen for 40 minutes, 45 minutes, or however, even 30 minutes to some line of exposition, or it's just the brain doesn't isn't wired that way anymore for young people. I mean, as a college professor, I'm not even sure how much my students are able to read, to engage extended texts. So these are some of the consequences of the internet that have ramifications.
Hmm.
Another huge one, I think, in my analysis was the advance of neoliberal capitalism, which was, in the 1980s, Reagan, Thatcher, who was it in Canada? Mulrooney, and sort of globalization, high tech competition, rollback government controls, efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. All this had consequences for people's careers. So millennials growing up in this world, it wasn't the old days in the US where you worked for Ford Motor Company your whole life. You might have a boring job, but it was pretty secure, and then eventually you pay off your house and retire. That was the old model. The new model was Your job could be outsourced. You could be moved anywhere in the country or the world. There was always people behind you who had skills you were competing against. So all of this put a lot more pressure on millennials, especially, to constantly be working on their careers, upgrading their skills, ready to move, etc. Well, that both takes time away from devotion to traditional religion, and it disincentivizes people from settling down. If you settle down, join a church, get involved in your neighborhood, well, that could hurt your career, or that could all blow up in your face if you had to move next thing to another city. And it wasn't just the practicalities of, well, I can't go to Bible study because I need to go to my MBA class. Neoliberal capitalism also changed the notion of what a self was, what a good life was, what we were here to do. And it wasn't this sort of moral development, spiritual development project. It was much more focused on material goods, consumption, competition, not being left behind, and so on. So again, neoliberal capitalism was not promoted to hurt religion, but it unintentionally had some of those consequences.
Okay, gentlemen, we're running out of time. There are some important factors. Chris, maybe you could just list them very quickly. We won't get into them in detail, but just to emphasize to the audience the scope and the number of factors that contribute to this.
Well, I'll just say, in addition, there are a lot of other factors we haven't really talked about here. How September 11 changed in the public imaginary what religion was. It kind of polluted religion, partly because the new atheists, made a general critique after September 11 that all religions were bad and the source of all evil. That in the public's mind, we went from, oh, religion is a nice, good thing, it helps people being good, to, wow, maybe religion is associated with violence and destruction and death. Again, nobody would say that explicitly, but at the macroculture, the associations and emotional associations are more powerful oftentimes than people's rational thought. In addition, there is what I call the third sexual revolution in the 2000s. The mainstreaming of LGBTQ had a big effect on sort of people's understandings of what's normal and acceptable, and traditional religious ethics didn't really match with that. The growing religious pluralism, the depressions, the despair that came out of the war on terrorism. There's a lot more factors that the book unpacks. We don't have time here to address. So.
Okay, you're right. So let's now talk about the outcome, where this obsolescence is taking us. Usually when we talk about something going obsolete, we usually make a reference to when it will disappear altogether is one thing, and we also often talk about what will replace it. And you do have a provocative idea about what's going to take its place, and I'm looking forward to that in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about it disappearing altogether. Will traditional religion in America, as you defined it at the beginning of our conversation, do you see that disappearing altogether?
No, I don't see that happening. I think eventually the rise of the not religious and people that are defecting, those trends will level off. There will always be, if we step back and look at human history and all societies, religion is almost a universal. And societies that have tried, or politics that have tried to extinguish it, like in Soviet Russia, fail basically. So there's something about being human that still sort of perennially attracts people back to the spiritual, the supernatural, the mystical, the sacred. And I think that will always be the case in America, especially given the long history and importance of a religion here. But it'll just be diminished, and it'll have to operate in a larger macro culture, at least as long as this zeitgeist is around. Larger macro culture that is just more hostile, at least not supportive, if not more hostile. So religion won't go extinct. No, not at all. There will be a minority of these traditions. And there may be sort of micro surges within them. For example, in American Catholicism, a lot of the most committed young people are quite traditional, actually. So, which annoys older Vatican II baby boomer generations. They don't like that, but so it's going on. But those are more smaller movements. They're not going to transform the larger macro direction of things.
So religion, capital R, I guess, that kind of universal need of mankind. One sociologist I read years ago said that man is incurably religious. And it seems to me that as soon as you're a conscious being, You start to wonder, you start to, wonder about the meaning of life. And, these are very endemic to the human condition. So, yeah, I won't think that would ever go away, but it may morph into different forms, right? And I guess that's kind of what you're saying, that we're in one of those times.
Yes, exactly. And it has throughout all of history. I mean, religion may be universal and it may be endemic, but it doesn't mean it's like permanent in any given form. Things change over time. And so the 1990s and 2000s, looking back, I'm arguing we can see, oh, there were huge changes that happened that had consequences for traditional religion and non-traditional religions.
Right. So what Scott just asked is a perfect segue to the second part that I wanted to get to. I said usually when we talk about something going obsolete, we ask if it's going to disappear altogether, and secondly, what will replace it. So let's talk about this. You mentioned in your book a new millennial post-boomer zeitgeist, and you talk a lot about cultural reenchantment. So what is this?
Yeah, so there's a chapter that's quite long that I tried to describe this, what I call the millennial zeitgeist. And zeitgeists are not easy to describe. I mean, a spirit of the age is not as easy to describe as the number of deaths and births in a year, right? So, but I think we need to do it anyway. A lot of the millennial zeitgeist does not have direct implications for religion, but it sets a context. And then some pieces of the millennial zeitgeist have direct views about religion, but some of that zeitgeist involves a deep distrust of pretty much any institution, including religious institutions. And here's where all the clergy scandals and so on really help to drive a distrust of religious institutions. Here are some words I have in the chapter to describe the character, the feel, the vibe of the zeitgeist. It's individualistic, it's anti-institutional, it's presentist, it doesn't have a deep sense of history, it's very relativistic, it's subjectivist. What really matters is people's inner felt subjective experience, not any objective truth. It's anti-authority, it's fluid, it's multicultural, it's minimalist, it's transgressive, it likes to break boundaries, it's pornographic, it's jaded, it's consumeristic, it's entertained, and it's reenchanted. So this is not like systematic theology. These are vibes that are floating around that shape people. People either feel it or they don't. It doesn't apply to everybody, but it's a general sensibility that creates a context in which traditional religion just doesn't. One of the words I use for it is there's a cultural mismatch. It's like it's not that the religion has changed necessarily. It just doesn't match up as well to the dominant culture. And I already also use this phrase polluted. Like within this context, religion feels polluted to people, whereas before it might not have. So yeah, it's a macro culture. It shows up in media. It shows up in fashion trends. Actually, it shows up in as I said, media program. It shows up in common slogans. You do you, don't judge me. It's all this characteristics that I just described sort of weave their way subtly through cultural life, and that creates a backdrop against which a millennial thing, do I want to still be Catholic or Mormon? And they say, probably not.
So, Chris, just to put some labels on this so that people can get a perspective and understand what we're talking about, people today, the generations, my kids' generation, the millennials, they're in their 30s. They're not very familiar with traditional religions in general, but they are very familiar and speak often about things like astrology, what's your sign, about the laws of attraction, about occult and magic in general. There's a number of things like this that it's in their conversations and it's in their zeitgeist. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that, Chris?
Yeah, so I use two words to describe what you're talking about. The first is reenchantment. So to be enchanted, means something like to conjure up with a spell, something magical. And so enchantment has been around for a long time, and even in American culture, it comes and goes in waves. Interest in esotericism and spiritism and so on. And I think what we're looking at now is a recent big wave of enchantment. So it's a re-enchantment since a more secular, I would say, earlier 20th century era. The other phrase I use is a culture. A culture does not trying to say it's all occult in the kind of the pejorative sense. The word occult actually etymologically means to be hidden or to be secret. So a culture is the culture of the occult. Cultures that develop around secret knowledge or hidden wisdoms. People need to be enlightened or to be inducted into new knowledge about how the world works. And that could be, say, the laws of attraction. It could be secret knowledge about esoteric rites. But I think that most people who are not in these worlds tend to be dismissive, like, oh, astrology, it's so stupid, people believe in that, whatever, haha. And I used to be one of those people until I wrote this book and realized I think it's more important. I've come to believe that there's a much more coherent set of traditions that have come together that express themselves in sometimes goofy ways or sometimes children's television. But in and through it is something more coherent and more meaningful to people that is attracting more and more Americans into it. So if I just want to throw out a list now of possibilities here, we're talking about everything from neo-paganism, Satanism, magic, esoterica, alternative healings, interest, belief that nature is sacred, interest in sacred lore or native or indigenous spiritualities. The very idea of I'm spiritual, not religious is a popular version of this, but it's not just its own separate label, personal identity label. It's part of a larger movement, New Age, manifesting, astrology, crystals. There's so much of this world going on out there. Even a vampire underground. Most people they'll watch a vampire movie and say that's interesting or scary, but there's actually a vampire underground in the United States. I mean, I've done field excursions into some of these worlds. It's totally fascinating. And part of what's behind it is a rejection of traditional, I would say, especially Christian or Abrahamic dualism, that there's a transcendence and that there's a creation, and that those are not the same things. In other words, it's a monistic worldview.
Mm.
Everything is one, everything comes from the one, everything will return to the one. Another difference is it pretty much completely rejects Christian notions of sin, and so therefore what needs to happen is a redemption from a God out of total grace, and that the human will, in an Augustinian sense, the human will is that which needs to be transformed. And it's focused much more on the mind, on consciousness, on knowledge. That's a fundamental shift in how people understand what's wrong with the world and what needs to change. There's a lot more to it, but yeah, this is what I'm using to describe reenchantment and a culture. And it's also hard to pin down because it's not organized the way traditional religion is organized. It doesn't come in denominations. It's much more fluid. It's more underground. It shows up in lots of products. So if you go on Amazon and search for the Tao of whatever, there's like bazillion books, the Tao of everything. It shows up in popular media in so many ways. Like you cannot turn on any streaming service without having gobs of shows about vampires and supernatural and chasing Bigfoot and just ghost hunting. It's all over the place. Buffy the Vampire. I mean, there's a history of this. Some key, all the way back to Twilight Zone, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, X-Files, Twin Peaks, etc. But it's just
Harry
everywhere,
Potter.
basically. Harry Potter is huge. Is
Yeah.
a huge influence in this. Huge influence
And
in
this is
this.
another case, I think, where the internet has had a huge effect because it can blast that out in ways that were not possible before.
Yeah,
I was
exactly.
also I was also wondering, is there a parallel to the 19th century, that kind of the rise of romanticism and transcendentalism, which seems to have been a reaction to the kind of Enlightenment scientific worldview?
Yes, absolutely. The deeper history of this has big tap roots in European and American romanticism, especially German romanticism. English
Mm.
romanticism has another version of this, but also related to those, Gothic literature and art, even nihilism, a philosophical and artistic nihilism and pessimism. So a lot of this draws on those roots, and in American tradition, specifically transcendentalism, as you mentioned, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau, connects to so many of these themes around the sacredness of nature, and it's a stepping away from the traditional doctrines of God and salvation. So yeah, it's out there. The other thing about it that works for in today's society is there's a dark side and there's a light side. There's a very serious dimension of this, and there's a fun, entertaining dimension of this. There's plenty of this for children that it's not malicious or trying, it's not even proselytizing. It's just an expression of this a culture. And of course, the other thing that makes it work is that capitalists realize they can make money off of it. That's why if one book, the Tao of Who, say, sells, or the Tao of Physics, then you have 100 other authors that want to cash in on this. So you have the power of capital investment capitalizing on every opportunity, whether it's movies, Harry Potter knockoffs, all of this interest in magic, or it's not just reading Harry Potter. Now you have Harry Potter meetup groups and costumes and everything else that gets spun off of that. So again, the capitalists just want to make money, but a culture is advanced because it's being promoted. And also, Scott, what you said before, in an internet world, things can go viral almost immediately in a way that in an older world, it took much more effort and sort of advertising campaign to get people to even know something existed. Now, if it resonates with people, boom, 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 it's all over the world.
So, Chris, do churches and seminaries and Bible colleges need to start thinking of a new business model?
Yeah, so here's my line on this. As a sociologist, my job is to see things in the world that matter, to describe them and to explain them to broader publics so that it's a kind of a social self-reflexivity to provide society, like, here's what's going on in the world, people. What do you think of this? My job does not entail having answers. I think there are implications of what I'm writing for churches and seminaries and so on that are profound. At the end of the book, I do suggest, even though I'm just a sociologist here in this context, I do suggest it's important for traditional religions to not just think, oh, yeah, this is a bit of a challenge, this is a little bump in the road. These changes are huge. The traditional religion's place in the larger culture has fundamentally shifted. And so, like, little fixes here, there, little band-aids, little adjustments to programs, I don't think are going to respond to this effectively. I honestly don't know what any answers are, if there are any answers, but I think what I would suggest if I was brought in as a consultant, say, is yeah, this needs to be taken very seriously, and a lot of thought needs to go into what are the implications of this? Why did we lose out on this? And what might be constructive responses that aren't complete gimmicky sellouts, basically? There's a lot of opportunities to make the wrong next steps, not intelligent, and effective next steps. So I would say, even though this requires some big rethinking, it needs to be cautious. But along the lines that you were saying earlier about preaching, it's not clear to me anymore what the value or effectiveness of the traditional sermon is. I'm not saying get rid of sermons. I'm just saying these at that level, I think this stuff needs to be rethought. Like, what is really essential to us, to our identity, to our tradition? And that may need to take very different, to use biblical language here, jars of clay that hold the treasures or wineskins that, hold the wine. It may really require some big, big changes. I suspect it will. I don't have a vision for what that would look like, however.
Okay.
But, yeah.
So, Chris, some people might say that this is an American phenomenon. Let's talk about whether that's true or not. Religious practice seems to be thriving in other parts of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa is showing a lot of growth in Islam and Christianity. In South America, Roman Catholicism is huge, and Pentecostalism and Protestantism are growing in leaps and bounds. And I shared with you a recent study, a big study done in the UK that suggests that 20-somethings and 30-somethings in Britain are apparently returning to church in droves. I don't know if you want to comment on those, or let alone Canada, where Scott and I are coming from, or Australia. We have a lot of listeners in Australia. So again, is this specific to the US or?
Yeah, that's a really good question and important. I don't think my story can be either said it's just specific to America or that it can be generalized elsewhere. I think there are parts of it, for example, the internet is a global phenomenon. And what I described is probably going to work its way out similarly elsewhere. On the other hand, there are other elements of my story that are very America specific, and they're not going to happen in Europe or Australia the same way. And so I think each so I guess what I'm saying is I think that there are general trends, that there are specific causal mechanisms, but how they work themselves out in different contexts very much depends on the national or regional history, culture, trajectories, religious backgrounds. Even within Canada, of course, how it has worked out in Quebec is different than, Vancouver or Ontario. So I've always tried to push against sort of generalized laws of life that supposedly explain everything everywhere about modernity and to try to be more contextualized and specific. Some of what I'm describing, England has already been through a long time ago, like the culture and reenchantment and spirituality and paganism. Yeah, that's been bigger already in England than it's been growing here, and it's been much better studied there than it's been studied here. So which is to say, there are parallels, there are similarities, but there are also widely divergent differences. There's an explosion of all kinds of religions in China, partly as a result of the sort of discrediting of Maoist communism and lots of other forces. So it's just not going to be the same everywhere. So that makes it really interesting. What are the parallels between the Anglo world of New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Canada, the Atlantic world, and where are the differences and why? I mean, I find that just sociologically fascinating. So I guess I'm just splitting the difference between, it'll always work out the same everywhere and everything's different. It's just complicated in the middle.
And maybe to tie a bow on something we brought up earlier in this episode, you were talking about one of the contributing factors to this obsolescence was the rise of the religious right. Let's come back on that in this context. So is this just an American story? We're asking, is it true elsewhere? But even within America itself, what about your claim that traditional religion in the U.S. is on its way out, becoming obsolete, and yet we see this rise, this very great rise of the religious right in American politics?
Yeah, so my story on that is this. The religious right has morphed into Christian nationalism. And it's not that I need every piece to fit in my story's puzzle perfectly, but I really do believe that the Christian nationalism associated with Trumpism is a symptom of obsolescence more than a proof against obsolescence. I think if you look at the discourse of the religious right over time, it's morphed, it's changed. Previously, in the earlier eras, the Christian right said, we need godly men and women, but mostly men, to be elected to positions of power, to establish and defend God's righteous laws in our nation's legal system and government and judiciary. That's been completely abandoned by the religious nationalism, which is, it's not, Trump is the opposite of a godly man, and everyone acknowledges that. It's that we need a godless, essentially, defender of us. There's a desperation. Here's what I'm trying to say. There's a desperation in Christian nationalism that was a little bit there before, but the extremism of it, the readiness to sort of get friendlier to violence, maybe even to overthrow the government. There's a desperation there that I think grows out of multiple forces. I don't want to oversimplify it, but one of those forces is sort of a gut level realization. Yeah, we really are, in my words, have gone obsolete. Like we don't have the cultural place that we used to have, and that provokes this desperation. And so I don't like the language of a last gasp of dying of a dragon or something, but I do think Christian nationalism is a form of sort of a greater lashing out. It's less reasonable, it's less strategically political, it's more desperate. And so, yeah, so the bottom line is I don't think Christian nationalism in its Trumpist form is a sign of strength. I think it's a sign of being in trouble.
I remember saying to my wife a few years ago when this was all going on that they would elect Satan if he said he was going to overturn Roe v. Wade, like that. That's kind of what it's come to. And I totally agree that the evangelical right that I somewhat nurtured it, I suppose. Yeah, it was all about we have to have godly presidents, and they railed against Clinton for his sexual immorality and so on. And look at how America is going down the tube. And that's completely
Yeah,
that's
that's
out the
gone.
window.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's
that's
gone.
abandoned. Completely
Yeah,
abandoned. Now, there still are in America evangelical moderates who, like the editor of Christianity Today, is an evangelical moderate from Southern
yeah.
Baptist background, and he still will say, "No way, Trump! Like this is not acceptable." So they're still out there, but the Trumpist phenomenon and the willingness to use intimidation and even punishment has really put those people at best on the defensive, if not completely marginalized them and drowned them out. So. Yeah, the politics is fascinating, but again, if you pay attention to the discourse, to the language, it's changed a lot, and that's a sign of something.
Hmm.
Okay, gentlemen, we should wrap this up. Chris, is there anything that we didn't talk about with the current book on the table that you wanted to say a few things about?
Yeah, so the book takes a pretty macro perspective on the zeitgeist, the culture as a whole. There are within it sub-traditions that really matter, and near the end of the book, I do an exploration of American Judaism, Mormonism, and Black Protestantism, and different things are going on there that are always affected by the larger zeitgeist, but like take their own tracks. Again, this is on the theme of it's got to be contextualized, it's got to be in a particular context. So, Mormonism we used to view as sort of the model of retaining your youth. And in my own scholarship, that's what it looked like to us. But it turns out that Mormon kids wait till later in life. They don't bail out of church when they're 21 or 23. They wait till later in life when they finally decide, I don't believe this, I'm out of here. And so it doesn't show up in a lot of studies of younger people. But there's a huge exodus of Mormon millennials from the church, which has the Mormon church really scared. And I just find it fascinating considering that's a reversal of how we used to think about things. On the other hand, we used to think about American Judaism as kind of in trouble because of high rates of intermarriage of Jewish young people with other people of other faiths. But actually, there's evidence. It's not conclusive, and it needs more time. But there's evidence that there's a slowdown, if not a reversal, of younger American Jews in sort of distancing themselves from religious understandings of Judaism. So, more Jewish millennials are actually more likely to associate with their Jewishness in religious terms than Gen X American Jews. And I have a story about why that's the case. There were interventions, there were a lot of investments, there were a lot of programs put in place to try to make that happen. That said, I do think that the war in Palestine and all that, it throws a monkey wrench into. So, we just have to see how that plays out. But again, the theme is the book is about macro culture, but within that, all of this plays out somewhat differently in different sub-traditions, which is just really interesting to me at
Yeah.
least.
And that last chapter sets the stage for the next book, which I'm really excited to see. This whole rise, this emergence of the new millennial zeitgeist. You want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, the working title is The Reenchantment of American Culture. Some editor will probably want something, sexier than that, but that's what I'm working with. And it's a reversal for me because I used to dismiss all this as really not that important, but we've conducted some of our own surveys on what people believe. And I guess the teaser is, or the trailer is, there are a lot more Americans, especially younger Americans, who are interested in this alternative quasi-religion or religions or spiritualities. There's a lot more out there. It has already penetrated business management, for example, the business world, especially the Silicon Valley world, much more very happy to use spirituality and mindfulness and meditation to essentially manage their people better. In the medical world, trying to figure out in medicine how to take spirituality and prayer more seriously. So yeah, and as I said before, there's a lot of money to be made in this as well. I don't think it's all just about that, but there's investment in it by capitalists. But the way it will impact things over time, a culture, I think it'll be latent for a while, and then it'll take longer for it to have overt institutional effects. But yeah, bottom line, it's big, it's out there, it's growing, it's fascinating. It cannot be understood through the same lens or the same categories that we've traditionally understood traditional religion. It's got to be taken on its own terms, and we need the concepts and analyses and frameworks that are appropriate to a culture and not to denominational religion. Yeah, so I'm really having a great time studying it, and I can't wait to get the book out.
And I can't wait till you do get it out. But that's the book to come. Once again, the book we talked about today, Why Religion Went Obsolete, The Demise of Traditional Faith in America, published by Oxford University Press. Chris, thanks for sharing this with us today. It was really great to have you on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for your interest. Thanks for having me on. It was a fun conversation. I hope this book stimulates lots of conversations. Like I said, I don't have the answers, but it needs to be broad, sort of public, especially in communities of faith, like sorting out what does this mean.
I agree.
All right. Thanks again. Have a good weekend.
All right.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.